So I'm going to talk a little bit about the dox wars. I'm going to talk a little bit about the current drama, but I'm mainly going to talk about kind of the life cycle of political movements and the life cycle of kind of most forms of, I guess you could say, organizations in general, and attempts to kind of organize fundamental forces of society, I think is probably what you would call it. So for those of you who are not aware, there's currently a lot of drama going on in our spheres, or I guess you could say my spheres. Basically what happened was Antifa, for those of you who don't know, Antifa is a SJW coalition, which is short for anti-fascist, and they're some of the most vicious people in the West. One of the things they do a lot is they dox people. That is, people who are anonymous online. They find out all their personal information. They take snippets of what the person said. They send it to their boss to try to get them fired. They try to destroy their families. Stuff like that. They're basically kind of the left's political terrorism squad. And I use the term terrorism literally because while they do occasionally attack people, I think kind of proto-Antifa knocked out one of Jean-Marie Le Pen's eyes, and he has a glass eye because of it. So they do attack people from time to time, but more what political terrorism means in this perspective is terrorism is basically any use of fear in order to obtain a political end. And in this case, threatening people to lose their livelihood, to destroy their families, etc., is a form of using fear to obtain a political end. So what's been happening lately is Antifa has been ramping up their doxing. So what it started out with is they succeeded in doxing Millennial Woes. For those of you who don't know, Millennial Woes is one of kind of the bigger celebrities, I suppose you could say, in our sphere. He started out kind of more making his own content, but over time he's made less and less of his own content. And now he mainly just does hangouts with various kind of semi-celebrities in our spheres, and he's kind of become more of a networker than an actual a kind of original thinker. So as to how he got doxxed, I'm not exactly sure. I think Richard Spencer read out his name at one of the conferences, and I think he went on like an alt-right radio show, and they read out his full name, and then they wouldn't take the video down. So you definitely had a lot of irresponsible people involved. But a blog, I think it's called 1,000 Flowers, formally posted all his personal information, and a number of British tabloids have also jumped on and posted his personal information. So as to what the exact status of the thing is, I'm not sure. I've seen some people saying that Millennial Woes is trying to flee. I don't know. I don't really want to give any details on that. Like, I'm not going to say his real name or any of that information here because that doesn't need to be spread more. But that led to counter-doxing by various groups. And then that led to the doxing of most of kind of the leadership of TRS. And probably the remaining leadership will probably be doxed soon. And so there's a stream of it going on lately. I remember one of the things that happened was a group of people had doxed Richard Spencer's mother and had been trying to harass her. And then there was counter-doxing, and they found out who the people were, and they got one of them fired for, well, harassing an old woman. So another kind of tactic that the Antifa started to use, that they started to pose as autistic edgelords on 4chan and Poll in particular as a way to try to get people to give them information, to let them into their spheres, and then they use it to get to get personal information, and then they post it online. And the other kind of useful aspect of this is by posing as people within the movement, they can kind of exacerbate existing cleavages. I mean, there's a lot of existing cleavages. The pagans versus Christians and secularists is kind of one of the most notable ones. The social conservatives versus social liberals is a big one. There's a lot of various cleavages, and by posing as members of different groups and doxing people and using as a justification whatever the cleavages they're trying to exploit, it's doing a lot of internal damage, and it's causing a lot more infighting than there used to be. So people have started to say, is the alt-right going to collapse? Is this burgeoning movement going to just fall apart and either be replaced by something else or just kind of disappear altogether? As with a lot of things, I think you really have to take a longer perspective, and you have to look at what normally happens to political movements throughout history if we are to kind of get a good grasp of what's happening and what's likely to happen. Now, first off, the alt-right was never any sort of organized movement. You had various people like Millennial Woes or Richard Spencer or whoever who kind of claimed leadership of it, but they never really represented more than a tiny faction of a tiny faction of a tiny faction. It wasn't even necessarily they had support, that the mainstream media just gave them more attention. There's never been any kind of poll, nor could there be, to determine kind of what the average view of the movement is, what the kind of general values are. And it's kind of, there's always been an understanding that basically the purpose of the coalition was to extend the Overton window, to allow more kind of left-wing ideas, more rightist, further right ideas to enter into public political discourse, to maybe bring back some ideas of national identity, race, gender differences, the nature of marriage, the role of religion in public society, lots of different things like that. And I think to that extent, we've largely been successful. Donald Trump got elected. I'm not saying we did that or we even played a significant role, but the fact that Donald Trump could even run for president and the fact that he could win, I think indicates that there has been a opening to a certain extent of ideas that you didn't have before. We've moved from globalist light to globalist extreme to like globalist light versus civic nationalist. Now, I don't like civic nationalism really, but the point is it has shifted somewhat. There is a larger degree of political views that are kind of in the mainstream than there used to be. That's not to say the left isn't still trying to repress us. Even in many ways they are as much as they used to, but they have lost some of their ability to define the narrative. And I think that's all the political coalition really was trying to achieve. And if it collapses now, I think it's achieved most of its objectives. But does it really need to achieve anything else? I mean, is this the end? If it collapses, if there's no more alt-right, if everyone just kind of goes their own way, is this the end of it? Are we all doomed? I'd say no, because the thing you have to understand is organized political movements represent something deeper. They represent a particular impulse. In the case of progressivism, the impulse that man can kind of become like God is I think at the core of it, which there's some truth to, but there's also a lot of issues with that, and I won't talk about that right now. And then in kind of the right word, you have the impulse that people aren't equal, and to pretend that people are equal leads to devastation and leads to ruin of a society. So you kind of have these eternal ideals behind specific political movements. You also have kind of general cultural and social forces behind these. And very often they're a coalition of a bunch of different groups, and they go through a lot of different iterations. So let's kind of go through some examples of what I mean. So one of kind of the most noticeable organized political movements of the last couple hundred years is communism. Now within communism, there is an immense number of deep cleavages. There was kind of the nationalist faction, people like Castro, people like the Sandinistas, people like a lot of the later Russian communists, who thought the way to communism was communism in one country, to try and make use aspects of your national identity to justify communism and to make communism the national identity. Then there was kind of more pan forms of communism. A lot of the African communist parties were pan-African, particularly Mugabe's, I believe the ANC. Some of the other ones, their focus was, okay, as a step towards building a global socialist state, we need to fuse kind of all the African countries together. And then there were some that were just more completely globalist, which I think was what Leninism and Trotskyism was to a larger extent. So you had these very deep cleavages within it, but it didn't, in some cases I'm sure it did, but communism still became a major political force. There were kind of strands of communism that I guess were more feminist. There were some that were kind of more socially conservative and patriarchal. But by and large, it was able to function more or less as a movement. If we look at kind of the various post-World War I reactionary, or I guess you could say rightist movements, there was a great deal of diversity among those. In Germany, you had the National People's Party, which was mainly authoritarian conservatives. It was aristocrats, military men, monarchists, that sort of thing. And eventually it kind of came into conflict with the Nazi Party, which was more populist and more kind of socialist. And I guess you could say kind of more centrist than the more kind of traditionally conservative group. In Hungary, you had the Aerocross Party and kind of the more moderates. In Hungary today, you have a similar situation. You have Viktor Orban, which is kind of a more traditional authoritarian conservative model. And then you have Jobbik, which is like the neo-fascist radical model. And you kind of have all these different movements that kind of coalesce around kind of a similar group of ideas, but have a lot of diversity between them. And yet sometimes they're able to eventually kind of reach a form that people can agree upon. Like in Spain, the right went through all kinds of different forms. You had the Carlists, you had rightists before that, you had you had the Phalange, you had kind of clerical fascism, you had all kinds of different right-wing movements that eventually kind of coalesced around Franco, and they kind of were able to build a broad front and win the Civil War and have kind of a right-wing state for a couple of decades. So I think that's common, and a lot of these individual groups collapsed numerous times. They lost numerous wars, but I don't think it overall affected the long-term direction of the movement. Movements very often collapse and then are reformed later. The Republican Party in the States started out, depending on how you want to count it, as the Federalist Party. Then it became the National Republican Party. Then it became the Whig Party. Then it finally became the Republican Party. Then it went through a number of other iterations. You had Teddy Roosevelt. You had him splitting off the progressive wing of the Republican Party. In Europe, it took 6 coalitions to bring Napoleon down the first time. And it took 7 coalitions to bring Napoleon down the second time. So I think that's important to keep in mind. Like, the first 5 coalitions kept collapsing, but they kept reforming. And the membership in each was different. Sometimes Russia was on Napoleon's side. Sometimes Russia was against him. Same for Austria. But ultimately, the anti-Napoleon sentiment remained there. The general opposition to a French hegemony on the continent remained pretty consistent throughout the entirety of Napoleon's reign. So I think that's important to keep in mind, that political movements go through various forms. Certainly the right in Japan went through a bunch of forms. You had the Imperial Rule Association, you had the Imperial Way faction, you had kind of the more liberal conservatives, you have the current government, which is kind of a coalition of Japanese nationalism, bureaucrats, big business, social conservatives, a bunch of different people, and the Liberal Democratic Party has gone through a lot of different forms over the years. So the success or failure of a particular political movement, I don't think is that important. And the alt-right will collapse and it'll be replaced by a successor movement. There's more or less always a successor movement. Prior to the alt-right, you had kind of more classic white nationalism, and you had NRX or neo-reactionaries. And those two have basically largely been subsumed, and I'm sure there'll be another split, and I'm sure there'll be other reformations. These things just happen all the time, and there's nothing wrong with it. So I think a lot of people who are screaming that the sky is falling because there's some internal drama just need to understand this was never even approaching a unified or stable political movement. It's barely even a political movement. It's just kind of a useful heuristic term to describe a group of people online who were trying to expand the scope of what was considered acceptable right-wing politics. I think that's really all it ultimately was. And while the current docs wars will probably lead to a collapse of TRS, maybe the alternative right website, some of the big names. So just to go back to kind of the original point one last time before we finish, liberalism in France took a long time. It took a lot of forms. You had kind of the extreme radicalism of the Jacobins. You had kind of national liberalism. You had liberal conservatism under the Orleanists. And then it kind of eventually joined together with the other kind of rightist factions to form Gaullism. So throughout history, you do have this wide range of movements that take different forms. But I think to a certain extent, they do represent certain fundamental values, certain fundamental beliefs that are common to a society. And the various forms of it grow or wax and wane depending on what the current public wants and what the current kind of political climate is. So don't worry if the alt-right collapses. It was bound to happen. It'll be replaced by something stronger and something more unified. And as they say in the Robin Hood movie, rise again and again until lions become lambs. God bless you all. I'll talk to you later.